Good morning, everybody, and thanks for joining this seminar, which is about Australia's progress towards hepatitis C elimination. It's the launch of the annual report of the 2023 launch. If I could have the next slide, Anna. Before we start, though, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which, first of all, that I'm speaking on. I'm on the land of the Wurundjeri people today, but also this report was prepared on the lands of the Burnet people of the Kulin Nations, where the Burnet is located, and also the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, where the Kirby is located. But obviously we've had data come in from many, many places and different lands. We'd also like to pay respect to all Aboriginal people and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are on the call today, and recognise their cultural and spiritual and educational practices and their ongoing connections to land, waters and communities, and that sovereignty was never ceded. Thanks, Anna. Also, I'd like to acknowledge the people who are on this call, but also beyond the people, there's others who are obviously not on this call, of people living with and with lived experiences. People can read this acknowledgement, but it's just really important that we remember that we had people from everywhere have, many people have contributed to this data with lived and living experience of hepatitis C, and it's impacted on their lives in many, many different ways, including people who have lost their lives related to hepatitis C and liver disease. And we thank everybody for their ongoing contribution to sort of really trying to sort of work towards get the elimination of this disease, but also acknowledging the negative effects of stigma and discrimination and criminalisation related to injecting drug use that is associated with hepatitis C. Thanks, Anna. Next slide, please. I always think it's really funny when I get asked to do housekeeping, but anyway, today is going to be, Anna's going to be presenting highlights of the report, which is available to everybody online to be looking at, and then there'll be a moderated Q&A. And I am assuming that people will be able to put questions or send questions in the chat, so I'll get you to jump into this, but it'll be a moderated Q&A, but also if people have specific questions about the report, please put it in the chat or in the Q&A section so that we can look to respond to those. But I think without further ado, there's also I meant to introduce the panel as well. Sorry, Anna.
Yes, please. That's all right.
I have read your instructions, but as per usual, as many people on this call will know, I'm not the best follower of instructions all of the time.
That's all right. Hey, you'll meet them later, but just
you're going to meet people later. But here's the panel. So there's myself, Greg Dorr, Jess Dumne, Elisa Pedrana, and Richard Gray. You can see from where they're all from. I think we've got a few others, haven't we, Anna, or is that it today?
We've got some apologies today. So we'll just note that Carrie Fowley from Hepatitis Australia and Elaine Montegriffo send their sincere apologies. They couldn't make it today.
Thank you. Next slide, please.
Now you're okay. Now you can
okay. Now before I go any further, though, I actually would like to say thank you to all of the people that have contributed to the report in terms of providing data from around the country. And I know Anna's going to say this, but I'd also just like to make sure that was really clear. But also I'd like to thank Anna in particular and Samara and the team for all of the work they did in getting the report together. So over to you, Anna, to present the highlights, and thank you.
Thank you, Margaret. Welcome, everybody. So my name is Anna Wilkinson. I'm here at the Burnet Institute. I'm on the EC Australia team, and I acknowledge the lands that I'm on today, which is the lands of the Wurundjeri people. So we're going to do some thank yous first. I know it takes a little bit of time, but it is really important. So the annual report is a partnership between the Burnet Institute and the Kirby Institute. And we really pay thanks to the editors of the report for their generous contributions and the time and the energy that they give to the report each and every year. And this is our 5th year of the report. The report comes together because people provide their data from their retrospective projects. So it's really a collaborative collation report. We don't own the data that goes into it. Everyone provides it for us. So I'd like to acknowledge the projects and thank those that provided the data and assisted with our many, many inquiries so the report could come together. And I'll acknowledge my colleague Samara Griffin from the Burnet, who's been seminal in preparing the report with me this year. So I'm going to thank 1 or 2 people per project specifically, but in the interest of time, but I do acknowledge that they represent large projects and teams behind them. So Jason Asselin and Michael Traeger from Access, Claire Bradley from Atlas, Farzaneh Zalola and Lisa Ma from the Australian Needle Syringe Program Survey, Daniel Vucic from the Migrant Bloodborne Virus and Sexual Health Survey, Bezard Harajizadeh, Greg Dorr from the Monitoring Treatment Uptake Project, Joanne Carson from the National Retreatment Project, Yumi Sheehan and Rebecca Winter from the National Prisons Hepatitis Network, Amy Kwan, Richard Gray, Jonathan King, and Sky McGregor from the Kirby Institute and the Annual Surveillance Report, Mandy Byrne from the Australian and New Zealand Liver Intestinal Transplant Registry, Tim Brody from the Stigma Indicators Monitoring Project, and this year from the Illicit Drug Reporting System. I'd like to acknowledge and thank Paul Armstrong, my colleague at the Burnet Institute, who's led a community consultation process for the report this year. And I acknowledge and thank the following organisations listed here for their contributions during this consultation progress. They generously give their time and energy to the report when I know they've got other competing priorities as community organisations, and we appreciate their input. We're going to go through some highlights of the report. This is some data from each chapter in the report. It's really a small proportion of only a large amount of data in the report. We do want to focus on a Q&A today. So you have the Q&A function available to you, and I would encourage you to start thinking of your questions now. You can pop your questions in the Q&A, and they're going to be put to our panel later. Because I know graphs and charts aren't for everybody. The Q&A is often way more interesting. So we're going to just have a little cook's tour, zoom through some data and some charts, but really it's about you getting a chance to ask questions. So start your Q&A now. So we're going to start with some data highlights though in chapter 1. So measuring new infections for hepatitis C can be challenging. However, Access, which is a sentinel surveillance system that recruits clinical sites, has data on patients linked over time, meaning we can observe repeat tests and therefore new hepatitis C infections and therefore an incidence rate. Data presented here were from patients who attended an Access primary care clinic. These clinics provide services to people at risk of hepatitis C, such as co-located needle syringe programs and opiate agonist prescribing. The key finding here really to focus on is the trend, and that's a clear reduction in the incidence rate from 2016. So there are much fewer new infections being recorded at these clinics among the patients since the introduction of unrestricted access to hepatitis C treatment, which is a really positive result. I'm going to move on to chapter 2, which is testing and diagnosis. Again, we have data from Access, but here we are looking at the number of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people attending sexual health clinics. So the solid bars are the number of individuals attending a clinic, the y-axis is counts of people, and the line is the proportion of people attending who were tested for hepatitis C. So it could be any type of hepatitis C testing. So this indicator, which we call test uptake, really represents engagement in some kind of hepatitis C care. The number of individuals attending, if you follow the solid bars, has remained relatively stable year on year. There's probably some COVID effect in 2020 and then a little bit of COVID recovery. However, what we do see is an increasing trend in the proportion of people tested when we follow this blue-green line. In 2022, a third of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who attended had some type of hepatitis C testing at these clinics. Here we are again looking at Access, but primary care clinics. So the dark bars are the number of men hepatitis C antibody tested within each year, and the lighter bars are the number of women hepatitis C antibody testing within each year. This year, there's a change to this indicator. We removed tests done after a person had tested hepatitis C antibody positive, meaning this data more closely represents incidence or new hepatitis C antibody positive tests. The higher levels of testing you can see among women, so our light bars, we think is related to universal hepatitis C screening as part of antenatal care. This is a piece of work we're yet to do, which is to separate out some of this testing. But the lines are the proportion of people hepatitis C antibody positive. We see among women, the solid line down the bottom, just under 5% of women tested antibody positive at these clinics in 2022. This has remained largely stable. Among men at these clinics, positivity has declined. So it was down to 10% of the people at these clinics testing hepatitis C antibody positive in 2022, and this is the lowest positivity we've seen since 2013. We're still looking at primary care clinics. However, we changed the population to patients who have had any history of being prescribed opiate agonist therapy. So, a really important priority population for us to be looking at. The dark bars again are counts of the number of men tested, and the lighter bars are the number of women tested. So overall, we see in this particular population, more men were tested than women. And in 2022, among men, the proportion of hepatitis C antibody test positive was 35%, and among women, it was a little higher, it was 40%. So this data really do highlight that among this priority population, over 1 in 3 people had a new hepatitis C antibody positive test result, demonstrating the importance of continuing to screen this particular population within primary care for hepatitis C antibodies. The data presented here is from the Australian Needle Syringe Program Survey. This is a long-standing serial cross-sectional survey of people attending needle syringe program sites with recruitment at over 50 sites in 2022. The data here is hepatitis C RNA testing, which is conducted from dried blood spot, and we see a substantial decline in the proportion of people with current infection. In 2015, 50% of men were hepatitis C RNA positive. This has declined to 12% in 2022. Among women, the proportion positive has declined from 40% to 10% in 2022. So these are large reductions in the number of people that are RNA positive within this particular population. Finally, to round out our testing chapter, we have the publicly available Medicare data on hepatitis C RNA tests for each quarter. These item numbers are RNA tests for diagnosis only and then are not used for on-treatment or post-treatment monitoring. And we can see that there have been declines year on year since 2017 in the number of tests. 2022 saw the lowest number of hepatitis C RNA tests conducted since 2013. Moving on to chapter 3 now, which is the uptake of treatment. Here we have data from the Monitoring Treatment Uptake Project, which uses Pharmaceutical Benefit Scheme claims data to monitor trends in direct-acting antiviral treatment initiations. So this shows us the number of individuals initiating first treatment, aggregated across 2016 to 2022, but shown by jurisdictions. So this data gives us an idea of the volume of treatment occurring in each state. Not surprisingly, the most populous states have the largest number of treatments, but it still gives us an idea about how many people we are getting treated. So between 2016 and the end of 2022, over 100,000 people nationally had been treated for hepatitis C. We have a 4th year of data from the National Prisons Hepatitis Network. This figure shows the number of treatment initiations nationally and the proportion of treatments that were initiated in prison versus in the community. This is first-time treatments and subsequent treatments as well this year. So there's a slight change to our data. This is now all treatments. In 2022, 35% of all national treatment initiations were in prisons. As community treatment rates have declined, the proportion of in-prison treatment has increased. But these data do highlight the role that prison-based treatment has in eliminating hepatitis C. Here we have data from the Monitoring Treatment Uptake Project. Yes, here we go. Here we have data from the Monitoring Treatment Uptake Project again, but with first and subsequent treatment shown in different colors. So there are ongoing declines in treatment over time. We know this, we've seen this before, but it's important to have a think about it. So there were just over 7,000 treatment initiations in 2022, and we've provided that split between the data this year so we can see, not unsurprisingly, that people are being retreated. So as we are treating more people, then we continue to see those retreatments. But we do have in 2022 the lowest number of people initiating treatment that we have seen since 2016. We're familiar with diagnosis and care cascades, which show people moving through the steps from screening and diagnosis to cure. So the first of our cascades, we'll present 3, is data from Access. And these were used to construct a patient-level cascade. So the people included in this analysis attended primary care clinics, the same clinics we saw earlier, and the data are aggregated from 2016 to 2022. However, it is a patient cohort. The access data links people over time and allows us to see all of the hepatitis C and treatment, hepatitis C tests and treatment on an ongoing basis, so longitudinally. And we can see that approximately half of the people included in this analysis who were eligible for treatment, that is, they were hepatitis C RNA positive, you can see in that third bar there that just over half actually initiated treatment. The Atlas Sexual Health Surveillance Network, similarly, can be used to construct cascades of care among patients for monitoring progress on testing and treatment. So these are people who have attended an Aboriginal community controlled health service as part of the Atlas network. The Atlas cascade starts here at the left with RNA testing. Of those who were tested for RNA, almost half were RNA positive. Of the individuals who were RNA positive, just under a third, so again, our third bar along, were prescribed direct-acting antiviral treatment for hepatitis C. Whilst these drop-offs from testing and treatment in both Access and Atlas seen can give us an indication of where we want to focus our efforts to retain people in the cascade, it is important to note that patients may have accessed treatment elsewhere, and this isn't captured in data systems such as Access and Atlas. Our final cascade, each year, the annual surveillance report provides modelled estimates for a national cascade of care. So this is a population level cross-sectional cascade, which uses observational data and mathematical modelling. We see the cascade estimates over 80% of people living with hepatitis C have been diagnosed, which is positive. However, there were just over 5,000 people treated for hepatitis C during 2022. This represents 7% of the estimated 79,000 people living with hepatitis C at the start of 2022. So this gives us, at the end of 2022, a remaining 74,400 people still living with hepatitis C. It does remain a challenge to collect data on the longer term outcomes of hepatitis C. However, we have data from the Australian and New Zealand Liver and Intestinal Transplant Registry on liver transplants among Australian adults. In the dark red at the bottom here, the number of liver transplants with a primary diagnosis of hepatitis C related cirrhosis has declined over time, which is a really good news story. Moving on now to chapter 5, which is stigma and discrimination experienced by people currently or previously living with hepatitis C and/or people who have injected drugs or currently injecting. Here we have data from the Stigma Indicators Monitoring Project from surveys of the Australian public. Methods of recruitment have differed between these years, 2017, 2020, and 2021. But what we want to highlight is there are a substantial number of people across these years, so looking at everything but the grey, who report they would behave negatively towards people because of people's hepatitis C status. The illicit drugs reporting system interviews people who inject drugs every year across Australia. So again, a well-established annual serial cross-sectional survey. This figure shows in the 2022 survey, approximately 20% of participants reported experiencing stigma in the past 6 months when visiting an alcohol and other drugs healthcare service, and 40% reported experiencing stigma at a general healthcare service. So looking at everything but the grey here, the pink is the people experiencing some sort of stigma. This gives us insights into what people are experiencing when visiting healthcare services, what people might encounter when they're trying to pursue hepatitis C testing and treatment. We all know, hopefully share the idea that primary prevention is a key pillar in the response to hepatitis C. So we always have a chapter in our report with a focus on primary prevention. So this is again data from the illicit drug reporting system, and this has shown declines in sharing and borrowing of needles. There's less than 10% of respondents reporting borrowing needles consistently since 2013. And lending needles was reported by only 8% of participants in 2022. So this takes us to our final chapter on modelling. So again, I'll do a call out for Q&A because once I finish this, we're going to start our Q&A. And this is the part where you're able to see me try and explain someone else's mathematical modelling work. So this is always the fun bit. So this is modelling from the Kirby Institute group, and it maps estimated rates of hepatitis C prevalence, incidence, treatment coverage, and liver-related deaths against World Health Organization goals. So our panel A shows people living with hepatitis C. Panel B shows hepatitis C incidence. C is treatment coverage, and D is liver-related deaths. So we are looking at our different colors of our lines here. So we can see in figures B and C that incidence and treatment goals will be met by 2028 under an optimistic treatment rollout scenario. So following the grey line here, which would be an increase to 6,500 people treated with DAAs each year. So above and beyond what we are treating now. However, under an intermediate scenario, so this is a realistic scenario because it's based on a continuation of 2022 treatment rates, so 5,200 people treated each year, only figure C, our treatment coverage goals, would be met by 2029. So not our incidence goals or our liver-related deaths goal. Under a pessimistic scenario, where annual treatment numbers decline to below 4,000 people each year, no WHO goals would be met. So this is our final slide of data highlights. So for those who don't enjoy graphs, the torture is almost over. So this is modeling from the Burnet Institute, and this estimated the impact of public health interventions on hepatocellular carcinoma-related mortality. This modeling focused on adherence to 6 monthly ultrasound screening recommendations and improvements to treatment and diagnostic sensitivity. So along the bottom here, we have our 4 scenarios. Our y-axis is life years per 100 simulated people over 10 years. So if you go up the y-axis, that means more life years, which is a positive thing. So the figure shows that an optimistic improvement to attendance at 6 monthly ultrasound screenings. So this is defined as 10 to 20% improvement in people coming to their ultrasound appointments would be beneficial and result in additional 20 life years in 100 simulated people over 10 years. Realistic improvements to attendance at 6 monthly ultrasound screening, so a 5 to 10% improvement in attendance at ultrasounds, would also be beneficial. This is an additional 11 life years. Treatment and diagnostic sensitivity improvements also led to additional life years. So this modeling really shows that increased adherence to the recommended 6 monthly liver ultrasound screening could have substantial benefit at a population level, and really highlights the importance of retaining the post-cure population in care and screening. I'm going to invite our panelists now to join us by turning on their cameras. I'm going to hand over our Q&A portion of today to Elisa Padrana, who's going to moderate. We also have Samara Griffin, who is our assistant moderator today. So she'll be just in the background helping Elisa. So while they get themselves sorted, I would again encourage you to use our Q&A function for your questions. And I'm going to stop sharing now and hand to Elisa.
Thanks, Anna. Thanks for that beautiful walk through the report. And I encourage everyone to please access it online to get more details. So I will be facilitating the panelists, and I just wanted to note that we have had a few apologies. So we have a slim panel, and we'll be farming off any questions to Greg, Margaret, and Richard, and Anna and myself are also going to remain here in case there are specific questions we can answer to. So for this panel today, it's the 5th report, and we have been doing this for a number of years now. We are increasing the data sources and the detailed data around key populations every report, which is fantastic. So increasing the amount of data that comes into the report. But we still see some continued trends in the challenges we're facing. And so the data shows some areas that need specific attention, and that is moving people from diagnosis onto treatment. Anna mentioned around 55% of people that are RNA in the Access data system have initiated treatment, so about 45% of people who haven't. This report is great at telling us where we need to focus and where there are some challenges, but isn't necessarily able to tell us why. So I did want to pose the question, which is to Greg initially, and then to Richard and Margaret. about how do we use this data to guide our next steps in the response to hepatitis C elimination.
Thanks very much, Elisa. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge Anna's amazing work on this report on behalf of Kirby. Really thank her for driving another report so successfully. Look, I think there's good news and bad news, as it has been for all the years that we've done this report. I'm continue to be encouraged by how we're tracking in terms of reductions in incidence of Hep C. So I think all the markers suggest that we're doing pretty well on that front. Probably the only major gap is incidence of new and reinfections in the prison setting. But I think in the community setting, we have strategies in place. Treatments prevention is working effectively. We're getting incidence down. We may even be getting it down more rapidly than our models are suggesting. So I think that's a really sort of good news sort of picture. On the sort of treatment declines and the sort of broader sort of linkage to care, there's still a heap of work to be done. I mean, there's a little bit of optimism if you actually break down the 2022 by quarters. It's not within the report, but the latter quarters are better than the early quarters in 2022, and the first sort of quarter of 2023 is looking better than the first quarter of 2022. So there's a little bit of optimism coming through in terms of the treatment sort of rates, but clearly we need this information to sort of enthuse us across the sector. And I think we've been through COVID, we've come out the other side. There's a lot of, I think, willingness to really sort of drive forward. So this data tells us where that action is required. It's ongoing screening, linkage to care. We all know that there's some various initiatives that are being implemented, including point of care, sort of nationally. So I think it just is a bit of a wake-up call for us as a sector to look closely at the data and really, as I said, reignite our enthusiasm for elimination. Thanks,
Greg. That's really great. A question next and following up is to Richard. What are some of the uncertainties around the key pieces of data that we've just been presented or discussed, particularly around those people diagnosed and untreated?
I guess, with all data, there's always uncertainty, and data's agnostic. It's, it doesn't care whether it's good or bad. It just, it tells you information. But I think a lot of the uncertainties, I guess, sometimes our data is it's unclear. So, we often, in terms of the national picture, we're focusing on notifications, which are a very broad category, and there's lots of issues there around duplications, which has caused us to change our estimates quite a bit over time, and things like that. I also think, there's also, I guess, a concern. We're very strong and do a very great job on looking at people who are at risk currently for acquiring hepatitis C, so people who are injecting drugs, got very good surveillance of those. But I also worry there's quite a large proportion of people who used to inject drugs and no longer in that sort of risk category, but they may have been infected a long time ago and maybe even been diagnosed a long time ago. And is that contributing to this sort of treatment gap where we're not finding people who are still have RNA positive, but maybe not turning up to an NSP, OAT, or drug and alcohol clinic potentially? And I think this is really key. And I think, we're starting to get there about trying to find people living with Hep C through various new programs and approaches, so emergency department screening studies, sort of the access network and building that to have a bit more surveillance of, people who used to be at risk, so to speak, not necessarily those currently. And I think another uncertainty for me is reinfection. And so really distinguishing primary infection, reinfection, and retreatment. So maybe people were successfully diagnosed, then treated, but then making sure we continue to follow them if they're at risk to make sure their reinfections diagnosed and retreated appropriately. I guess that's a few thoughts for me. I guess just following on from Greg's comments for the first question, I was thinking, this does obviously fantastic for highlighting. It's really highlighted some gaps, but I think, and we are trying to address those gaps and understand how they come about. And it's always a process of responding to the information we have at hand and to drive our response. Yeah.
Thanks, Richard. Very illuminating. This next question is for Margaret, following on the same topic. Do you think we need to give more thought about the data on people's current hepatitis C status and ensure we focus in the right areas? This does relate to what Richard mentioned, that there is likely good surveillance of people currently injecting who are accessing services related to their current drug use, but perhaps not necessarily for people with a historic history of injecting drug use, but perhaps not necessarily accessing those types of services.
I'm going to answer yes and no to that, Elisa. We can see, and Anna didn't present it in part in the slides, but not the whole thing. We can see, and just sort of if you remember that when we looked at primary healthcare services, services in access where people were receiving OAT, that of the people who got tested, a very high proportion, there was a significant proportion of people who were newly diagnosed. So that's the first thing with hepatitis C. So it's like, say, people attending OAT, so they may or may not be still injecting drugs whilst on OAT, but that there were people there that we were newly diagnosing. So that tells us actually that in a very obvious place, we should be going and still doing a better job there. And the piece of data that Anna didn't present that we know, which is in the report, but didn't present on, is a significant proportion of people still attending those services are actually not getting tested. We can see that, in fact, they have not been tested or they have not been recently tested for hepatitis C. So my first sort of thing would be to say, where I think is pretty low-hanging fruit, but we need to do a lot of work around policy and working with drug and alcohol services, is how to help them have a more sort of process, I guess, a more sort of simplified but sort of ongoing process structurally to be regularly testing people who are on OAT or attending those services, because we know that they're not being tested. We know they're not being tested regularly. Some people have never been tested at all, but when they are tested, there's this high proportion. So that's the first thing. I actually think there's a few places we can be going, which I'll call still, people talk about it being low-hanging fruit. I don't think that's the best way to describe it, because sometimes it's really difficult when you've got busy things going on in a service, but we need to get those processes sorted out. I still think there's other places as well where we can be looking at how to engage with that group of people who are on OAT, may not have been injecting for some time, or who are injecting but on OAT, and sort of, and work we're doing, and I know others have done overseas, looking at the role of pharmacies. So I think there's this. Similarly, I think to keep on really, as Greg said, putting the emphasis on the prison services as well. Finally, I think, and this is work being done by Mark Stuvet and others in a partnership grant involving people from all around the country, departments of health as well, is really thinking about how to utilise, and this kind of gets to sort of the point that Richard made about somebody may have in the past been notified with hepatitis C a long time ago, but not in a recent way. So that when we look at that, 80% people diagnosed, a proportion of that might be from some time in the past where they're not engaging in the systems or the standard systems, and really thinking carefully and thoughtfully about how to help or how to re-engage with that group of people. And I think using surveillance from the past, as well as trying to really be thoughtful and mindful as well, that not all of those people will want us to suddenly charge back into their lives in a way that's clunky. So we have to be really mindful about how their lives may have moved on. So how do we re-engage? I think it's critical, though, that we do, because of that risk of people going on and developing cirrhosis, and then if you're cirrhotic, HCC, because you want to stop that from happening. So if we're to be successful in the elimination targets, one of them is to stop hepatitis C related deaths. And I think that sort of came up critically as well in the models at the end, is that we're really going to struggle to do well with that, but there's really simple things we can do to improve it. So they're the places I'd be looking.
Thanks, Margaret. That last chapter was definitely some new data that we haven't had in previous years. And so that's really important to note, that there's clearly indications of room for improvement around liver cirrhosis monitoring and management. Jess. Hi, Jess. I can
Hello.
see you. Welcome. I'm glad you're able to join us.
Thank you. I'm so sorry about the late joining.
No problem. We're just in the midst of going through some questions that people have posted in the online chat. So I will have a look at those. And the next one really relates to prisons. So I will offer this question up to everyone on the panel. And feel free then to stick your hand up if you've got a response. The question comes from Adrian Garinge. 35% of people starting DA in treatment is significant, and we recognise that prisons are really increasing their impact in the elimination response. However, there are implications for prisoners who are serving short sentences and may have issues navigating or initiating treatment in prison, and therefore be released into community, and they may not have then the continuity of care between being in prison and then leaving, stability of treatment. Have prison nurses and health staff been facilitating this transition for ease of access? So this is a question that I might offer you, Jess, initially, if you're comfortable. Otherwise, I will come back to the other panelists just around what we know about prison transition programs and continuity of DAA treatment through that transition.
I'm certainly happy to offer a community perspective. I certainly don't profess to have the complete understanding of what's in place nationally, but certainly from a community and peer perspective, I'm happy to offer a perspective.
That would be great.
Yep. Certainly, we all rates clearly show that, rates of transmission within prison are definitely high. But in terms of around transition, there's definitely a lot of issues in the continuity of care, especially with the movement as well of prisoners or for those short periods, or only serving short sentences. But often they can be, moved between 3 placements within that time within the system. And when they come out with the housing is across the board one of the biggest challenges, and that certainly adds to the high transient rate of this population. And I think there are manifold issues at play, in terms of the spectrum of needs, and coordinated, integrated approaches just aren't the standard norm, unfortunately.
Thanks, Jess. I might open up to Greg, Richard, or Margaret. I know, Greg, you are involved in at least some of the prison-related work up in Kirby.
Yeah, so a few things to say. I've been working in Parkleigh Prison the last sort of year or so, and I do a monthly clinic out there, and I write more scripts in a month in Parkleigh than I do in a year at St Vincent's. So certainly still a lot of Hep C, need for Hep C assessment and care. Look, I completely acknowledge the need for better linkage between prison and community services. And there's a lot of facets to that sort of broad need. But one of the other needs is continued sort of therapeutic development. So, for example, we're about to actually continue a trial that we started when we had access to sofosbuvir on the PBS before Gilead removed it from the PBS as a sort of a single agent. So we're moving forward with a trial of Mavorite plus sofosbuvir for 4 weeks. And I think that's the ideal sort of potential setting for a 4-week treatment duration strategy. Many people on remand are there for weeks and not months. So if you could get an effective, shortened treatment duration, that would be a really important sort of step forward to optimising treatment completion in the context of prison-based care. And that's for first-time treatments, for reinfection, retreatment, etc. So I think we need to keep pushing on the therapeutic sort of development front because the pharma industry have sort of pulled up stumps. So it's up to us in terms of pushing forward with investigator-initiated sort of work in that area.
Thanks, Greg. That's definitely something innovative and new in terms of the prison treatment programs. Richard or Margaret, did you want to make a comment about the prison transition space?
So Tim Papaluka did some really nice work that showed it was definitely possible. And this is where I think the importance of nurses working both within prisons and community and also peers, I think is really important in that transition from prisons into community. So that would be my first thing. And we know that there's often a sort of a revolving door here. So that's the first thing, is that there's good handover, because when there was good handover and there was interventions, the ability to maintain people within within care and completion of their treatment was much greater. So I think there's a structural thing that can be done. And I think this also, I mean, there's many issues as Jess outlined as people transition out of prison, where to get some support more broadly and improving that for all sorts of things, not just for hepatitis C care. I mean, it's a period of extraordinary risk for people as they come out of prison. And so I do think we need to be thinking more broadly about the supports and care that are in place for people, so that not just for their hepatitis C, but for other things. But I think that can include hepatitis C, that engagement, housing,
There are also
drug use, all sorts of things.
There are also some unfortunate drivers for maintenance of high risk taking behaviours. You know, I sort of know a lot of people who have only sort of gotten on opioid treatment once they've gotten in prison, just to deal with being in prison, and then maintain that because like a pack of Bupe is worth about $1,500 in prison. So yeah, unfortunately there are factors which can skew people's motivations to sort of maintain those high risk taking I guess behaviours and involvements.
Yeah. And then the other thing I just wanted to highlight, and that's some work being done, I think, so first of all, some work that was done up in Queensland, and then also work being done by Alex Thompson and Beck Winter. And so basically the National Prison Group and Andrew Lloyd and others is also looking at outside of prison. The majority of people actually in sort of the correction system are actually on community services orders. And so also looking at opportunities there to provide support and broader health care as well. And again, in some ways to sort of try and avoid that our great success in hepatitis C care is occurring or a significant proportion in the justice system when people are being incarcerated, when in a perfect world, this simply should not be happening. So I think it's really important that we're trying to look across all of those things and making sure that in terms of thinking about just hepatitis C care, we're not just thinking about hepatitis C care, but we're thinking about a broader health care provision for people with the hope of helping avoiding incarceration.
I think one of the other issues is the huge diversity of sort of strategies for screening and treatment, assessment and delivery in the prison setting across the country. I mean, there's huge variability across jurisdictions. There's contractual issues that impact on the delivery of services. Even within jurisdictions, often there is large sort of variability. So I think the National Prison sort of hepatitis networks really plays an important role in trying to sort of get some better sort of standardisation, harmonisation of sort of screening and across the sector.
Thanks, Greg. I might shift to another question for Richard. There is a data-specific question, so you can nerd out about data. It comes from Mark Stuve. It says, changes in some metrics are influenced by trends in people who remain to be treated, which is declining. And compared to 2013, there is less testing, and it's the lowest since 2013, but there are also less number of people living with hepatitis C. And his question is, do we need to put more thinking into changing denominators of those at risk?
I think we do, but I think we need to also acknowledge that, you know, there's a balance here between absolute sort of numbers versus relative change in things. And I think absolute numbers are still very useful, and our sort of national modelling projections are based on the number of people we need to treat, in a sense. So it does take into consideration the changing denominator over time already. When we say, we want to treat 6,000 people or so to meet the WHO targets. And so I guess we've got sort of an absolute number to compare to and see how we're tracking. But obviously, Mark's right that, as we have less and less people living with Hep C, it doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad thing that we see less and less sort of treatment numbers testing, so to speak. It's just making sure, that proportionally, are we reaching the right level? And are we reaching the right people, I suppose, in a sense? So are we making sure we're not missing people in those numbers? So, the numbers going down because we've kind of got all the easy to reach people, so to speak, and sort of there's a smaller number, but really important number of people that we have to reach in our numbers. So I think always having more indicators is essential to really map out and understand what's really happening epidemiologically with our response to Hep C.
Lisa, just to add to that, I mean, there's still some uncertainty around what the Medicare billable testing tells us. So, for example, in New South Wales, there's a large proportion of testing that's not Medicare sort of billables done through New South Wales Pathology Services. That's not in the data. We're trying to sort of get a system of collating that data with the Medicare billable data. There's also the new testing screening technologies, point of care, so DBS, point of care. We need to sort of consider those sort of tests in these sort of trends, as well as the changing, shifting denominators. So you've got a shifting denominator in terms of the number of people living with hepatitis C. However, the denominator of people at risk of hepatitis C probably hasn't changed much, and they require ongoing testing, even if they're being cured, for the detection of reinfection. So there's lots of different things at play here to try and get our head around what's actually sort of really happening in terms of trends in screening and ongoing testing.
I think the critical
Thanks,
one,
Greg.
if I was to be, I take your point, Greg. I think there's a whole lot of stuff we need to be kind of thinking about how we monitor and others. But at the end of the day, our treatment, the number of people receiving treatment, and I was similarly to you a little bit delighted when I saw for the first time what I called an upward jig in the number of people being tested. But at the end of the day, being treated. But at the end of the day, if we're only treating, if we treat, it doesn't matter what we say and all of the maths and all, as I say, all the models in the world, if our treatment numbers have fallen off substantially, we're not going to make our targets if we're treating only, say, 3,000 to 5,000 people a year, unless we're being, because to me, there's two things happening. There's a group of people who've had disease for a long time who might not be receiving treatment, so the people that Richard was referring to, and then also if we think about people where there's ongoing risk, if we think about incidence, even though it's falling off, we still have to keep up a certain amount of treatment there. So I think we just need to be also just going, what's our final scoreboard, which we can measure, I think, a bit more accurately, which is treatment uptake, which is lower than we would like.
Thanks, Margaret. I've got another question from the audience, and I'm going to paraphrase just to help simplify. You mentioned this ongoing pattern of people being diagnosed but not necessarily starting treatment. And the question is around, does stigma and discrimination impact on treatment uptake? Question mark. I'll go to Jess first. And then the second part of the question is, was this significantly different to what happened in 2016, where stigma was still an issue, but we had far greater treatment uptake? And have things changed? Have the populations changed? Has the dynamic changed? What do we think has shifted, or has anything shifted? So Jess, I'll go to you first, which is, how do you think stigma and discrimination is impacting on the proportion of people taking up treatment?
Look, I feel like there's sort of, as someone who who identifies as a peer within the community, there are so many layers. Sorry, that's my 18-month. There are so many layers to stigma and discrimination, and I guess an awareness and an avoidance of it when it comes to it for people who use drugs. You know, it's a manifold issue, from, you know, people in uniform not wanting to be seen on camera going to a fit box to, you know, often point of care. You know, that's when they do sort of point of care testing. For instance, I'm from Nimbin in New South Wales, which is sort of a high, you know, drug using community, but they often have point of care testing at the neighbourhood centre, which in exchange for vouchers in town. But, you know, there is a visibility in a non-judgmental town like that. There's not. I feel like there's not as much fear in engaging in something like that, especially, you know, where there is, you know, incentive with local stores and things. But I can see it's, while it sort of might not be at that end, certainly, you know, at the prevention and engaging in harm minimization activities, and I guess things that can visibly identify you within that community, and the role that that has in prevention, while might not necessarily be at the testing point. I think, you know, there is a continuum here of interventions that ultimately have a contributing impact on incidence, prevalence, and access in the end to screening and treatment as well. And I think we need to be sort of manifold in how we approach that. And you know, as was saying earlier, it's sort of there are so many actors along that continuum and points of entry, but, you know, I think there needs to be some sort of coordinated standard and agreement. I guess I think some sort of standard of non-negotiables, that no matter at what point you enter that continuum, you know, you can expect to be treated with you know, the same set standard of respect and openness, and you know, not have any reason to fear negative repercussion, whether that be social, employment, whatever, you know, whatever that may be. And I think maximizing the people that are across that continuum and departments, you know, there needs to be sort of a whole of service and government approach, not just a singular department.
Thanks, Jess. I'll open up to anyone else on the panel who wanted to respond. If there's anything distinctly different from the challenges we're facing now as compared to 2016.
So, I mean, Elisa, we're talking about this is what I call the phases of elimination. So I think I'd love to think that, in fact, there's less stigma and discrimination now than there was in 2016, but I don't think we've got evidence to say that, but I don't think we've got any evidence to say it's got worse. I think really what it is that there was a group of people, the ready, willing and waiting, the waterfall effect or whatever, the warehouse and waterfall of 2016. And now I just think we have to go that the next 50, the first 50%, I'm not going to say it was straightforward, but relatively straightforward. I think the next group of people to whom we need to be providing quality care are just going to be that group of people who are going to be more, the system has been more complex for them, possibly their previous experiences have been not great, all sorts of good reasons for why they may not be prioritising hepatitis C testing and care at this particular moment. As I say, if you sort of think about it, for sort of many people where they've got many other life priorities, being treated for hepatitis C is actually doing a community service because this is not their priority at this particular moment. And I think we need to be really thinking about it in those terms of people stepping forward for care in that way. And so I think it's not that it's got worse. I just think it's a different population where we need to be thinking really carefully about how to engage them in a way that works for them as opposed to us and the health system.
Thanks, Margaret. I want to offer Greg and Richard last chance to say a word before we wrap up.
A couple more points. I mean, I think there's a bit of evidence that stigma-related hepatitis C might have declined since 2016, but stigma discrimination related to injecting drug use hasn't really changed much. And that sort of makes sense, I think, with hep C being an easily curable infection, that alignment with some decline in stigma. I think Margaret also pointed out the issues of other life, priorities and practicalities. I mean, some of the work that we did in terms of our data linkage, we've looked at gender-based treatment uptake, and there's clearly a lower treatment uptake in childbearing age women. We've looked then at the number of births and when those births are, and there's lower treatment uptake in women that have delivered during the DA era and had more kids. So that sort of suggests that there are some sort of prioritisation and practicality issues, but that means that we need better antenatal screening and linkage to care. We need to evaluate third trimester treatment. So there's a few things that we need to do there to address that specific issue. I think the one other point I'd make in terms of all of this is that there's still some uncertainty about who hasn't been treated. I think the new sort of big data, new data linkage initiatives through ABS with the PLEDA mechanism, they'll be national, they'll include housing, social welfare, census data, a whole range of other administrative data sets. So that'll give us a much more granular picture of the sort of Hep C cascade of care and who's missing out and where they are and what social determinants of health are really driving some of this.
Last opportunity, Richard.
Oh, Greg just stole my last points there in response to one of the other questions in the webinar chat about, what we need to do with our data and getting better data and stuff. So the linkage data he talked about will be crucial and very useful for our response. I don't think I really have too much to add to what has been talked about in terms of just the stigma and discrimination and things like that. Obviously, Jack had a question earlier about overseas born people, and we know that their access to care for other diseases and issues around stigma and discrimination and sort of things from their cultural background and stuff like that are concerns, and they will probably be potentially people who are less engaged and have a lower priority with the Hep C and stuff like that. So that's another example of finding that people, I guess, Margaret said not the word easy initially, the 50% is not easy, but when you get lower and closer to elimination, it kind of becomes harder and harder to sort of get there, I guess, in a sense, and try and find people. And obviously the people that we're trying to reach have probably got many other things happening that make it, so to speak, hard to reach there, to treat their Hep C and make sure they have good care afterwards.
Thanks, Richard. I'd like to thank all the panelists for their contribution. And Jess, thank you particularly for making the effort. I know it sounds like you've got a little wee person with you. And I'll hand over to Margaret to close us on.
Thanks.
Thanks, Elisa. Conscious of time, I just would also like to thank the panelists. And Jess, I understand that your reason that might have been a muck up with dates and dates and time. So thank you so much for doing under those what must have been very stressful circumstances for you. So it is much appreciated. Can I again thank all the other panel members, but also as well thank again all of the people that contributed data to the report. I think the report is only as strong as the groups that are prepared to provide us with the data that goes into it to make it a comprehensive report. So thank you to all of those. And again, thank you very much to Anna and Samara for all of the work that you've done on the report every year. It's I think a really strong report that's really useful and helps guide our way forward. So thank you. Again, thank you to everybody who joined us today. And thank you for your ongoing work in the elimination effort. People hear me say this all the time. I do think elimination of hepatitis C as a public health threat in Australia is truly achievable, but it'll only be achieved if we all continue to keep on working really hard at this and continue to put in the effort from community, from researchers, from health services, from government. So let's maintain the rage. Look forward to speaking to you all next year to show the progress. Thanks.